Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Claire Sestanovich, discussing her debut story collection, Objects of Desire, in conversation with Annie Bashai. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we are able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We will get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of Objects of Desire. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We sincerely and greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Thank you, Zoom. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked Live Transcript on your display and click through the options. And lastly, as you have probably experienced during virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues might come up. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Claire Sestanovich is an editor at The New Yorker. Her acclaimed stories, some of which appear in tonight's book, have twice been featured in the pages of The New Yorker, as well as in the Paris Review, Harper's, Electric Literature, and The Drift. She is joined in conversation by her editor at Knopf, Annie Bashai. In addition to Claire, Annie has previously worked with authors including Valeria Luiselli, Nell Freudenberger, Diane Keaton, Michelle Zauner, and others. Before joining Knopf's editorial team, Annie was previously a bookseller, book machine operator, and event staffer at Harvard Bookstore, so we are so excited to have her back with us tonight. This evening, they'll be discussing Claire's debut story collection, Objects of Desire, a piercing portrait of the lives of women estranged by desire and longing that Brandon Taylor calls subtle and sophisticated, written with sensitive lucidity and warmth. Uniting us with a unique yet familiar cast of characters, a college freshman returning home, a mother pondering her own life as her son prepares to get married, an office worker exhausted by the ambitious men surrounding her, the stories and Objects of Desire thrum with both drama and tenderness, depicting the moments when the mundane slips ambivalently into the extraordinary, when the daily accrual detail amounts to something unforgettable. I will end with praise from the great Leslie Jameson, who says, "These stories know strange, important truths about what it feels like to be alive." And gosh, wouldn't we love to know what that feels like after a year of stasis? We're so excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Claire and Annie.
Hi. Claire, I think you're muted.
You bet I am. You'd think I have, but the learning curve persists. I was saying thank you for such a lovely intro. And thank you all for being here. I've done a number of events with people that I've admired from afar, and Annie is someone that I've admired from up close. So it's a special treat. And I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the book, which, as Benjamin sort of summed up much better than I ever would or could. There are 11 stories here, and I'm going to be reading from one called Security Questions in the middle of the book. On days when she's unproductive, Georgia likes to imagine she's pregnant. That way, she'd be accomplishing something. Dana, the man Georgia is sleeping with, has a wife without a uterus. Years ago, when she still had one, she gave birth to a son. He's the same age as Georgia, 26. And Dana only ever speaks of him with pride. When Georgia found out about the son, she Googled him right away. Tim. The screen on her phone had been broken for months, so she looked at pictures of him through a spider web of cracks. A portrait in black and white, a group photo, an action shot from a long ago soccer game. Dana says they look alike, but this isn't really true. The most you could say is that they have brownish hair, biggish noses. For years, Georgia swore that she would never have a day job. All she wanted was to be an actress. She was in movies her friends made and a few plays in theaters the size of living rooms. But now she works at a company where no one is over 40. The company sells fancy meal kits, individually wrapped ingredients, laminated recipes that get delivered straight to your door. There's a ping pong table in the office and a petition circulating to replace it with a foosball table. It's okay to wear shorts and sandals too if you're paid enough. Georgia's boss has stubby toes and hairs sprouting like antennae from the tops of his feet. Tim is a filmmaker. He made a documentary about cowboys and another one about Mennonites. Small projects, but well received. In an interview, he says he's interested in dying ways of life. It has been decided that Tim has potential. He's someone who will become a bigger someone. Maybe, Georgia thinks, predicting who will be successful is what men do instead of getting pregnant. What they do when they want to watch and wait to see what will hatch. Late one night, she streams Tim's first documentary on her laptop. She isn't sure whether she's hoping it will be good or bad, but in the end, she's impressed. When she finally falls asleep, her dreams are filled with bearded men and wild, snorting horses. Debbie never wished she had a daughter until the hysterectomy. One of her co-workers accumulated 4 sons in the quest for a girl, which Debbie thought was pathetic. Once, when Tim was young, she said it wistfully, not quite seriously. One of each would have been nice. That made Tim upset. Above all, he wanted to please. I can be a girl too, he said, hopping back and forth on one foot. No, you can't, Dana said sternly. And Tim stopped hopping, frozen on one leg like an ungainly bird, his face scrunched up with the effort not to cry. Debbie had the surgery when Tim was 23. Her neighbor had gone under the knife that same year, and she came over to tell her what to expect. Hysterectomies make you extremely constipated, the neighbor said, and extremely happy. The pamphlets from the doctors said Debbie might experience a feeling of loss. The doctors themselves said little. In the neighbor's case, there was no cancer. There were fibroids and continuous debilitating pain. Her uterus expanded all the way up to her rib cage. Without it, Debbie's neighbor said, her body became a room, like cleaning out the garage. Later, Debbie repeated this to Dana, who nodded sympathetically, as if it sounded sensible. This wasn't the reaction she was looking for. The garage, she said? My uterus housed human life, not a Honda. A Ford. What? Her husband drives a Ford, Dana said. Debbie hadn't stayed overnight at the hospital since giving birth. After the surgery, she was tired and sweaty, or else she was tired and parched. Pregnancy had a sound logic. You lost a fetus, but you got a baby. This time, the thing they took out of her was her. Tim texted, "Get well soon." A few minutes later, or whenever you're ready. A fruit basket arrived at the hospital, even though nothing was in season. Unripe strawberries and melon carved into flowers. Imagine a daughter, Debbie told Dana. I would have been excellent at dealing with girl puberty. His mouth was full of honeydew. The painkillers made the insides of her elbows and the backs of her knees itch unbearably. Breasts feel like tumors at first, she said. Some girls freak out. You mean, Dana finished chewing, you freaked out. The flower stem was a sharp wooden skewer. They're not soft at the beginning, they're hard lumps. He poked her thigh absent-mindedly with the skewer. What I'm saying, Debbie continued, is I would have given my daughter adequate information. She snatched the stick out of his hand. You're high, Dana said. I would never have let her mistake growth for death.
Thank you, Claire. Beautiful reading. Yeah, and just want to say it's so lovely. What a special experience to get to be up here with you up on this Zoom screen after just a wonderful editorial journey together, and now to be back at this bookstore where I used to work. And yeah, so thank you everyone for being here. And yeah, so I'm glad you started with that passage, Claire. As you know, it's one of my favorites. And I want to go back, if you'll humor me, just to the first sentence when you say, on days when she's unproductive, Georgia likes to imagine she's pregnant. And so, you know, you have this association right off the bat of pregnancy with productivity. And I point that out because it's a theme. Pregnancy and like living in a woman's body is a theme that you really like deftly explore throughout all of these stories. And then at the very end of the excerpt you read, we got the line, "I would never have let her mistake growth for death." So I'm admiring here the just the care you put into all of your lines and how you develop these themes. So I wondered if you would talk, and I guess to add to that, I would say that I love how in this story, that's the sort of introductory motif is like productivity and pregnancy, and yet the story is populated by these two women, Georgia and Debbie, Georgia being the 26-year-old girl who's sleeping with Dana, Debbie's husband. And neither, they're two women who either aren't or can't be pregnant. And so that, you are in this realm, as you are in many of your stories, of sort of thinking about but not having, or wishing but not having. And I think it's just really fascinating how you put these two women in dialogue with each other in this story. So can you talk a little more about, this story, which is called Security Questions, and how these two women, Dana's a man, Debbie and Georgia, came to live together on the page?
Yeah, I do think of them, as you say, as sort of being these characters who are in transitional moments in their life in some capacity or other, but the type of transition where they aren't exactly sure where it is they're coming from or where they're headed from. So it has a little bit the texture of the, interminable transition, or they really do wonder, like, am I getting anywhere? Or is this what stasis looks like? And I think that is sort of the premise from which both of their fantasizing emerges. Georgia is wondering, she's not really wondering, do I want to get pregnant? She's wondering, like, would that make me feel better? Would that make me feel different? Would that give me momentum in my life? And likewise, Debbie isn't really thinking, I wanted a daughter. She's more entertaining these counterfactuals, and the creation of counterfactuals is what the work of writing fiction is. So it makes sense that it appeals to me, but I'm also interested in their allure for all people, writers, or just sort of storytellers in the more mundane or existential sense. So I was trying to bring these two women together, I think, to see a little bit about how their longing, in spite of happening at very different life stages, have something in common. And I think we have a certain bias to think that the type of ambivalence and questioning and questing that we see in Georgia is sort of, it's symptomatic of a certain age in life, or a phase of life. It's, the type of thing about which we would say it's just a phase, or it's adolescent, it's protracted adolescence. And I'm kind of skeptical of that. It makes sense that Georgia, who works at this, somewhat silly sounding startup, is maybe feeling these things. And we kind of internalize that pretty quickly. But are we as comfortable and familiar with the ways in which it crops up just as much for somebody like Debbie, who ostensibly, we'll find out later in the story, she's actually quite accomplished. And yet I think she also feels herself somehow at a crossroads and has really no sense of whether she's going to even take one of the forks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I remember sort of going into this book project with you after I read your first draft, and we had a conversation, and you were like pretty resistant to the idea that this book was about millennial women, or that this is like a quote unquote millennial book, dare I say. And yet, like, that's kind of, we ended up writing the jacket copy that says, like, 11 stories about women, young women's lives. But really, there's so much more to it. And you do something very deliberate by having these older women. Debbie is not the only, postmenopausal woman in the story. Like, we have moms populating this book, she is the only one in that story, but not in the book. And you do a lot of really interesting things with like parents and their children, which I do want to get you to talk about. I want to ask you to get at that about the character of Tim here. He's one, you know, boy, child, man, son who features in this collection, and I think he plays an important role. So
yeah, it's funny I mean, I also remember feeling the resistance about this is not more millennial literature or something. But I don't know, I guess it occurs to me, maybe the book is about how we're all actually millennial children or something. You know, I do think a lot of the themes that we attach to the anxious, ambivalent, you know, wayward millennial, those are definitely things I'm interested in. And I'm interested in the ways that like they're actually true of so many people. Tim. Tim is really interesting to me, and I, you know, I think Tim is a character that exists. Actually, I guess interestingly, I'd totally forgotten about this until now. Tim was two people originally in the first draft of this story. Tim was a twin, but Tim is a character who really, I think, emerged much more fully in the final draft, thanks to your sort of like insight about what I was up to in this story. And I mentioned that because I think I wasn't totally clear about why mother-son dynamics felt compelling to me in this book, but there are a number of stories and some stories that aren't in this book that were sort of circling that dyad and trying to get at something about the dynamic, but I didn't really know. And in some of the drafts, I think it was clear that I didn't really know. And this story is, I think, a good way to talk about it, because I actually think the Debbie Georgia relationship, which is sort of a mother pseudo-daughter relationship, I think helped clarify to me why the son relationship is interesting. And, you know, Debbie and Georgia are involved in this sort of dance of mirroring. They both are involved with the same man. They have a kind of, they're quite self-consciously seeking glimpses of themselves in each other. And they know that that's what they're doing. You know, I basically, I think it's true that I most like to write about self-aware characters. I'm not trying to like reveal something about them that they are totally oblivious to. And Debbie and Georgia are, I think, good examples of characters who are thinking a lot about their sort of like position in a group. So anyway, they're doing this, they have this relationship that's complex and subtle in lots of ways. And as we see, it can't really be summed up with, you know, as admiration or envy. It's more complicated than that. But there is something, it's a closed system, there's something reciprocal going on. And by contrast with Tim, there's sort of this type of identification that's foreclosed, I think, for both of them, in large part because of the conventions of the gendered relationship of the mother and son. And it's, I think, harder for us to talk about and harder for them to really suss out what is going on. And there is, at least in part, some sense of alienation. And I think I found myself really drawn to the idea of trying to figure out what that distance looks like, and the distance that one might feel toward a child, distance that might feel even like jealousy, or, you know, jealousy of youth, of potentiality, of the sort of the idea that you can entertain when you're young, and really much less so when you're older, that, you know, life is all ahead of you and you get to choose. And Debbie is somebody who, she has a lot of achievements, but she no longer has as many choices. And that is, you know, that's really something she has to reckon with. And, you know, I'm youngish, and I feel familiar with the conversation that, you know, I've talked with my peers about the moment when you realize like your parents are people too. And it's a formative revelation to have, but I basically found myself interested in the revelation that might be or must be happening on the other end as well, which is parents realizing that their children who aren't actually children anymore are people too. And this story, I think more than any other in the collection, sort of brings these generations together in a way that we watch those revelations happening simultaneously. And it's this collision and of sort of, I think, reciprocal recognition of personhood in one another it's really illuminating, but it's also really uncomfortable. And discomfort is always, I think, a promising place for stories to start or end, or so.
Yeah.
Trying.
Yeah. Vis-a-vis that, what you just said, I last night tuned into an event with the wonderful writer Dana Spiotta, and she was talking to George Saunders about her book. I mentioned, it feels kosher to mention this because Dana Spiotta loved Claire's book, so just sharing all the love here. But she said that what she does when she writes is she constantly reminds herself to turn her characters toward jeopardy, and like, but that's how you figure out who the character is, that you make them face the jeopardy that like they're the most sensitive to.
Right, and jeopardy sounds super dramatic, but I actually think it is, even just the revelation that your son is like older than you've let yourself realize, that can feel perilous, as I think it sort of does to Debbie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not to I don't want to dwell on this theme for too much longer, but yeah, you draw that out really beautifully with, as you'll learn when you read the story, Debbie's mother also comes into this story, and Debbie has the realization that she's now older than her mother ever lived to. And so I think, yeah, you have those two generations almost mirroring the Georgia sort of imagining Debbie's life and recognizing the strange collision that they have.
Right.
So
sorry.
Go ahead.
It feels totally crucial that Debbie is primarily functioning as a mother in the story, but she's a child too. And I think we see ways in which she does identify that way still, as the child of her mother.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about humor. I think there are at least a couple laughs in that passage that I suppressed for everyone's benefit. But you have the men sort of making fools of themselves. You have like Dana having this very funny line about like, he's just, we're getting this very nuanced look into Debbie's understanding of her own body, and the fact that she had a girl child instead of a boy child, and Dana just sort of vastly misunderstands it. He's like more preoccupied with the car that the neighbor drives. And so, you could feel free to depart and talk about other stories too, but I want to, part of what you do really, one of the things you do really especially well is kind of like zapping these sort of like cliches and contradictions that we have, and showing us where we're actually not as smart or original as we think. You just have that really like incisive observation of people in our culture. And so I want to know how you think about balancing sympathy for your characters, including the men who are, none of them are flat. You have these round characters who are also the butts of some jokes, and it's a gendered book where we do, in the sense that it's looking at gender in a certain way, but how do you think about the way of your position as the writer, where you're inhabiting these people sympathetically, and where that sort of the same sympathy sort of involves like a prod that's going to make us laugh, and if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I have been asked about humor several times, and it is such a tricky one for me because it feels like this sort of mysterious machine that I'm always a little bit warily operating because I don't know how it works. And what you said actually clarifies something for me, which is I do think I find the humor that feels, I think, conducive to like sympathetic portraits of everybody are moments of misunderstanding. And of course, moments of misunderstanding can be really tragic. And in a lot of, I think there are moments of people talking past one another in ways that feel profoundly sad. But there is also, like, as you describe in this moment with Dana and Debbie, it's the humor is that they're just like basically having separate conversations. And I think that feels maybe like part of the crux of how I think about like portraying characters ethically, is I do want, even in the moments when they're failing to connect with other characters in ways that we might identify as sort of a lack of compassion or of generosity, I do want us to feel like, oh, we see that they're in their own world, as we all are, and we see it with specificity that perhaps gives us some sense about why it is hard to really come out of that world and enter somebody else's. And I think it's probably true that Dana is the least sympathetic character in this book. I don't know if you agree, but and so he was a sort of, I think, good case study for me of like, how do I make sure that when I'm prodding people, as you say, or zapping them or whatever it is, that it isn't laughing at them, really, that it is about a sort of like circumstantial humor that maybe also contains pain of ways that people are missing each other. And so, the takeaway, I think, in a lot of moments when characters feel inadequate, which I think many characters in the book do, is not, I never intend to damn them. And I hope that I've sort of set up their inadequacies in ways that we see. I think it's really hard to show up for people in the necessary ways that they require, that they want and don't know how to articulate. I mean, part of what the desires that arise in these books, the reason why they're so tricky is that they're hard to name and they're hard to explain to someone else. And that can often produce these misunderstandings. So I think that's part of the sympathy, is never sort of indicting somebody for their flaws, but feeling curious about what it is that led those flaws to emerge or to create conflict and fissures in their life. Does that make sense? You're muted.
Sorry. No. Just wanted to make you feel better about being muted at the beginning. Yeah, so that what you said about characters talking past each other, it really resonated for me, especially about the way you write. And it made me think about, one profoundly sad moment of disconnect, of misunderstanding in the book, which is in a story called By Design. And what, I don't think it's a spoiler alert to say that story involves an event that one character thought was a consensual sexual encounter. It's an employer and her employee, and one of them ends up pressing charges, and so or filing some sort of legal complaint about it. And I know from speaking to you that you didn't set out to write a reverse Me Too story, but what did it feel like once you realized that that's what this story was going to be, that you were going to have a woman in a position of power feeling, not really knowing that anything went wrong, and her male employee suddenly reveals that there was something wrong, and how did you think about handling that in this book?
Yeah, that story like unfolded in ways that were really surprising to me, and I guess I don't think that's how short stories emerge for everybody, but I definitely do embark on them with no sense of where they're going to end up. And so what I started with, and I've sort of touched on this a bit already, talking about my interest in mother-son relationships, was sort of a middle-aged woman who, despite having quite a lot of like formal power in her life, she's a the dominant force in her family in a way that we might think is non-traditional. And she's a female boss and has a type of ambition that I think is often coded as male. And sort of in spite of all that structural power of a sort, she's kind of coming to terms with a certain type of disempowerment, or a feeling of being, I mean, disempowerment, I think, is probably more starkly than Suzanne, this woman, would put it, but a sort of a feeling of being at loose ends. And I imagine that most of us have a sense of what that kind of, the way that aimlessness can feel quite a lot like disempowerment, but also in its own way, quite frustrating, because it doesn't seem like disempowerment. You know, it isn't dramatic. It's sort of deflation, and it's aimlessness, and there's no obvious drama to latch onto in what you perceive to be your own unraveling. And I think part of what Suzanne, the character, is reckoning with is the way that that feeling has been the product of gender dynamics that she has really spent a long time resisting believing exist. Her life has really been, I think, defined by defiance of convention. She resists marriage. She, again, is sort of like the powerful wife. She's the girl boss, or whatever we would now say that she would not say. And then she reaches this moment where she realizes, like, well, actually her miscarriage really changed the direction of her life. The peculiar, like, business of being a female boss has really changed who she is and how she's perceived by people around her. And all that produces behavior that I think we might label as toxic masculinity in some ways. And it is the product of these very gendered structures that she's found herself within. But I take those structures to be the premise of the story, not the conclusion of it. So it's sort of how I think she's trying to figure out, how do I navigate these structures that I'm suddenly seeing, or how do I resist them? And is it the case that whichever I do, it will be a lose-lose? Because as we ultimately end up seeing in this story, the kind of succumbing to expectations of what she should be as a woman and challenging those expectations lead to destruction of a lot of different varieties. It's destruction, it's self-destruction of a pretty painful sort to watch. And it's also destruction that she's inflicted on her family members, her coworkers. So it is that very, very layered causal process that I was sort of trying to tease apart. And the particular flavor of destruction that we see here is, you know, a sexual misconduct, though I think it could have been other things too.
Yeah, thank you for that insightful answer. You actually sort of opened that story up for me in yet another new way. I guess, okay, so I want to be sure to get to talking about, you know, your work and how you do your work, given that you have this really fascinating dual role as a writer of your own fiction and an editor at The New Yorker. So I guess I'm curious, and I'm sure our audience is curious, you know, how those two facets of your, you know, role in the literary world and the world inform each other. And, you know, feel free, I'd love to know, like, if there are specific writers you've worked with recently at The New Yorker who, or not recently, but like, you know, what's your, you know, what have you really taken away from doing that, and how does it interact with your writing?
Yeah, it's very, I think I would have said before I was either a published author or a employed editor that I was a pretty scrupulous, and I would have thought, like, good self-editor. You know, I tend to be somebody who, like, reads from the top every day and, like, is changing lots of things along the way, and find it difficult to decide that a sentence, much less a story, is complete. And I think that belief is a pretty like pernicious one in general, because it means that you think you've got a first draft and you're like, well, yeah, but I've been editing all along. So this is great. This is ready to go. And I think the process of being an editor and being edited by other people has sort of surprisingly late in life disabused me of the idea that there is such a thing as a excellent, good, much less excellent first draft. And it's really, I guess I a little bit regret using terms like good and excellent, because the difference between a draft and a revision is rarely, I think, summed up by like some assessment of quality. It really, the best editorial experiences that I've had on either side of the desk or screen or whatever it is these days, is about, it's conversations that really reframe the way that both people engaged in the process think about what the project is. When I think of ways that you change stories of mine, I mean, yeah, there were moments where you were like, the sentence doesn't make sense, and that was extremely important to hear. But it was also sort of basically asking different versions of the question, like, so what's this story about? What are we trying to say here? And I actually think in my experience, editors and writers very freely start saying we about stories. And I think it's really lovely. I'm just like, I never feel bad about it, because I'm like, yes, this is extremely collaborative at this point. Like, we are saying something. And I do think the embrace of that collaboration is, I don't know, it feels alternate. Like sometimes it's mostly just totally illuminating. Sometimes it's really relieving, because there are things, there are problems that you're never going to see your way through on your own. It really does require fresh eyes and fresh insight. So I think the main, and I don't think you need to have both experiences to sort of have this revelation about what good editing looks like. I hope that, writers who haven't done editing themselves feel this too. But I do think it's made me just really appreciate the process of it all, which sounds a bit trite, but there is a version a really long time ago of this book that I could have said I wrote by myself. And it was a version that I'd never printed out, that I'd just sort of, or maybe I'd printed it out and like scattered it in little piles over my room. But it's so different than this book. And I wouldn't, there's that funny feature on Google Docs where you can like see the tracked history like by every minute. And, I live in fear of it, but that is a little bit the sort of like palimpsest quality of what it would look like if you went through every single revision that this book has gone through. And that to me is, sometimes it seems crazy that this is a finished book. And then when I think of all the sort of joint effort that went into it, I have a new level of appreciation for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Are there ways that editing an editor was weird for you or interesting for you or odd?
I knew I couldn't get anything past you because you have like the most insanely sharp eyes, and like, these stories, it shows when a writer reads their work from the start every time they work on it. I think that's a really interesting question. I think that
we can talk
about
good.
No, I think that you had already asked some of the same questions that you knew I was going to ask you yourself. And, maybe the sort of questions that any editor might have asked, like about what these stories are about, and, how is X functioning to help us get to that, help us achieve that like ultimate story that fully fleshes out what it's meant to flesh out. And I I felt like my job was just to like hit on those, what I thought would be those sort of like reflex points with the most authentic reactions I could, because, you know, at a certain point, being an editor is really just being a reader and knowing how to filter like your moment to moment reactions to the text for the author. And so I felt like, whether this is the product of your being an editor or not, like you were very aware of like the sort of big questions about your own writing, and the fun was in, you know, incorporating that into a conversation about how the story gets read and how every little moment in the text can like help achieve that end. I don't know if that's helpful or addresses the question.
Interesting to me.
Yeah, so I guess well, okay, I wanted to ask you what you were reading while you wrote these stories, whether you read short story collections while reading, whether you avoided fiction altogether. You know, you could never escape, you work at a magazine, but tell me about reading while writing short stories.
Yeah. No, I think reading while writing feels to me in some ways like the most important thing to be doing to ensure that I actually like feel like I can keep going. And yeah, reading and maybe like people watching or something like that are sort of the inputs that I feel I constantly need. And you know, these stories were written and revised over a number of years. So the answer kind of changes. I think I was reading a lot of short stories at the beginning, and I was reading a lot of short stories. So I read a lot of Amy Hempel stories. I read a lot of Grace Paley stories that felt to me like they were sort of modeling a certain type of compression. And I actually think there's a way in which that led me astray at first, because I was over compressing things. And I was writing a lot of like weird fragmentary stuff that seemed really like evocative to me and not to anyone else. But I think the sort of compression is, to my mind, the thing that distinguishes the short story. And I mean, in a sort of obvious sense, it's short, but also distinguishes it as like, when it's done well, it's the thing that leaves you with this sort of, I don't know, the sense of completion, but still some sort of unfinished, well, unfinished is not the word we would ever use. I guess evocative. There is some like sense of real potential that you leave with, even when there's an ending, in the formal sense. I'm thinking of other story collections. Lucia Berlin's collections, which were recently reissued, were really felt like a kind of breakthrough to me, not so much in the vein of compression, but in the sort of like attention to ordinary detail, and especially to the ordinary details on which like interpersonal dynamics hinge. She's somebody, and this maybe gets to your point of like, for lack of a better word, unlikable characters. She has a lot of men where you think like, wow, I really wouldn't want to be married to him, or who nevertheless come through in this extremely richly, compassionately drawn way. And that felt like a pretty formative lesson, because in a story, you just don't have that much space to conjure up a character. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about misunderstandings between characters, but there's also this real risk of like the fear I have as a writer is that readers will misunderstand my characters. And so a lot of what I am trying to do is like pick the right moments and pick the right details that will, you know, of course people will have different reactions to the characters, just as you have different reactions to people, but that there will be a sense that like you have the information you need, and you sort of see the sensibility of a person, even if you can't see the full view of their life in, you know, the span of 15 pages or something. So I think those are the short story collections that really leap out to me, and those are all examples of writers where I thought pretty explicitly like, oh, I'd love to write like this. And it feels equally important to me to be reading in modes that I'm really not trying to replicate. Excuse me, I have air conditioner cough. So yeah, like the voraciousness of the reading also feels really important. Like, don't just be reading in registers that you're trying to mimic, also be reading things that maybe not that you don't like, but that seem really like beyond what my voice would be capable of or would be interested in.
I recall that some reviewer said that your short stories are the kind that you want a whole novel to be written about these characters, which is a wonderful compliment. And yet I'm not quibbling with the reviewer, but I think it opens up an interesting question about, what belongs in a story, what distinguishes like the content and the people in, say, a story, like, the way they come through in a story versus potentially in a novel. And I guess my question is just last question, I think, before we go to Q&A, if that sounds good to you. Although I think I may have already answered one or two of these questions, or asked them to you. What do you think about how these people became the subjects of stories, and how, does it work to take a character that you invented in a short story and expand them? Do they continue to live with you? Do they beg to be written more about? Or do you think that, there's something singular about the like apparition of a character for a single story?
Oh, such a good question. Having not yet written a novel, I feel I have to be somewhat agnostic on the question of whether these characters could occupy a longer, fuller work. But I remember having a conversation with a friend at some point in the process of writing the book. I don't exactly know when. And he was like describing a frustration with stories where he was like, yeah, you get to the end and you just think like, wait, I wanted to keep going. Like, I'm trying to find out what happens to this person. And I think it's a frustration that a lot of people share. And it's a reason why the form is, thought of as like odd in some ways. But I guess I have this feeling that sense of expansiveness of the way that a life and a character really can't be contained in this form it's part of what's really intriguing to me about it. And I think it's in some ways the greatest achievement of the form is to leave you with that desire to occupy more spaces and more events and more phases of life with these people. And so I kind of, most of these characters I wouldn't want to write a novel about, not because I find them like uncompelling, but I just, it would be a lot of time. It would be a lot of inventing. Who knows? But I do really feel like I want to create that feeling that they should be given a novel. Because that does feel, I don't know, it's a way, maybe it's a way of that a literary minded person would, dignify someone's life, is to say, this is book worthy, this is world worthy. And that is how I feel about all these characters. Even when I'm not going to write their life story, I feel that I want to sort of perceive and really feel the effort that they have put into their life story. Like, that is how I guess I do think of us all as being really like involved in a narrative project, whether you're a writer or not. And I think that way about these characters is like, this is their narrative project. I am involved in it, but like it exists in this much more expansive way. And I want the reader to feel that expansiveness that seems so crucial to getting at like the value of a life. We couldn't ever describe it, but we can say that like it needs to take up a lot of space.
So well put. I think I think that's true of your stories, that they invite, they invite the reader to want to see more and to understand subconsciously or consciously that in the background of what we've seen of these people's lives, there is like a fuller thing. And yet in the span of the story, to have some sort of arc of discovery within, there's like a tiny little segment of the life that even as it's opening up, a sense of reality that comes with like implicit questions, you are giving something to us. And I think that has closure. And I think it has exactly to do with that narrativization that you're talking about, that narrative project, because we don't see our own lives in chronological order in, the way a person would write a factual biography of us. We're picking up little fragments that make sense to us in their own little arcs. And that's just something that you capture really particularly to you, I would say. It's a characteristic of your writing, and it's something that these stories have to offer. I will pivot to Q&A if, okay. Please submit your questions. And let's see, I'll start. From Frankie, we have, I'm curious about how you are or were able to continue to work on fiction over a period of time where I assume life was not always consistent. Did you observe changes in plot lines in your writing due to, well, life, location change, bad days, good days? TLDR, how do you balance fiction writing and living your own life story?
Yeah. That's a great question. A friend of mine was once, who's also a writer, was describing to me a certain frame of mind that you can be in where everything that happens to you feels like it belongs in the story you're working on at that moment. So it's like you see somebody on the subway to work and instantly it's like clear that they're an adjacent character in the story. And I really, that sensation really resonates with me. And it can of course lead you to overfill your stories with random commuters. But it also, I think it speaks to a certain way that like when writing feels to me like it's working well, it's like, it's a frequency that I'm vibrating at throughout a day. And everything feels not quite like research, but kind of like accumulated experience that is informing what I'm writing about, what I'm thinking about, and maybe it's ultimately stuff that I'm gonna erase or cut or never show to anybody, but it does feel all part of a kind of holistic creative process, which sounds pretty hokey, but I guess is an authentic way that I would put it. And this was actually interesting for me to think about in the course of the pandemic. At the, in the most intensive moments of lockdown, I really felt I perceived like a dip in creativity. I was like, I really need other people and I need other people's lives to give me a sense that this is, that this isn't just like my own made up thing that I'm up to, that this is like, has to do with the larger world. You're back on mute.
Sorry.
Sharing the stage, classic.
Yeah. Apropos, I guess, to pandemic, another question is, your stories work a lot with small spaces, objects of desire. The story is set in a tiny apartment, and the story you read tonight made reference to small stages. Did the sort of millennial condition of smallness, small property, small bank accounts shape the space that your stories occupy?
Really interesting. It's funny, I remember in our first conversation maybe that you like asked me where a couple of the stories took place. And I was like, I think pretty defensively was like, well, I don't, it doesn't really matter or something like that. Or there is a way that, and I think hopefully we ended up clarifying the settings that needed clarifying, but I think it actually speaks to something, well, in part a deficiency of my writing, but also my drafting. But also a direction of my curiosity, which is like, I am really, I think, most compelled by the immediate surroundings that people are engaging with. And sometimes, you know, whether it's San Francisco or New York, that's very relevant. And you need to know whether someone's walking across the Brooklyn Bridge or the Golden Gate or whatever it might be, to use some millennial examples. But I am, I think, more curious about the constraints and the very quotidian ways that like the room you're in ends up shaping how you act. And it's the type of thing that I think a little bit like physical detail, you know, of like people's bodies in fiction, it's really easy to overlook, or it can seem like the type of thing that's only there for like scenery. You know, we're all taught you need to like explain what the house looks like where someone lives or something. But I do want to get at the more sort of like interesting effects of that like paraphernalia of our life. Of, you know, in one story, there's a woman who lives in a house with this extremely tall door, and she has to stand on her desk chair that's always swiveling underneath her. And I wrote that image because it was extremely evocative to me in the moment. And I, you know, it was vivid and I needed to put it down, but it became a sort of like thinking about her precarity within her life in a more figurative sense also. You know, that is to say, the image didn't begin as a symbol. It like began as an image, and it led me to thinking more about like what the forces of her life were like. And that's, I guess, how I see rooms and chairs and smallness operating.
Yeah, that great question and great answer. I think that there's the small spaces alluded to in the question are not the only ones in the stories of this book. And when you read the book, if you haven't already, there's just so much to delve into. These are the kind of stories that a second and third read will reward. And yeah, I advise you to look carefully for those spaces, look carefully for like the paraphernalia, as Claire calls it. There's so much, and you actually addressed something that I was going to ask you, which was about imagery, because I find the images in your stories so striking, and often like the most memorable thing, that there's an image that stays with me after I've read it. And I like what you said about those unlock the themes rather than vice versa. That's a sign of good writing, perhaps you could say. Okay, I don't want to go too much. I'm going to limit my own talking because we have questions. We have two great last questions. Let's see. First, from Emily, we have how do you arrive at the titles of the stories? A lot of them have a certain lens. Maybe I can't put my finger on until I reach the end, and then it casts the story in a sharper light. How do the titles factor into your writing process?
I think the simple answer is I feel very tortured about titles. In my ideal world, I write the story, someone else reads it and says, oh, here's the title, and that's it. And actually that did happen in a couple cases, where I remember sending the story called Brenda to my agent, and like Brenda was the name of I had not written a title. It was the name of the document, and I was like, ugh, I'll never be able to title this, but I'm not going to spend time thinking about it right now. Whatever. And he responded before he'd even read it, and he was like, love this title. And I really did feel like, oh, okay. Glad to hear it. I'm also embarrassingly going to get a charger.
Okay, and while Claire, go ahead.
But I think there is, I mean, this is something that I hope I'll get better at and get over or whatever, but I think it actually does speak to a way that, because I always do titles last, I think other people do it the opposite way, but that's how I work. It comes at this moment where I really feel the need for, I feel the need for someone else to like reflect back what is happening in the story to me. And I feel very not stuck in the story, but immersed in a way that is so, I think, detail oriented that a kind of like summary sense of it feels really elusive to me. And I really crave somebody else's like verdict, for lack of a better word. And yeah, I think that does like, just like speak to the utility of another reader at especially at moments of kind of like vulnerability or uncertainty in a story. Because it is exactly when I finish a story and need to title it that I feel most uncertain about its worth or coherence as a whole.
One last question. I know we're already a minute over time, but this is a good question from the wonderful Zachary, who you may not know, Claire, but he is the keeper of your files at Knopf, a wonderful production colleague of ours. Anyway, could you talk about the jacket design, how it came to be, and how you feel it ties into the book?
Yeah. So here's the cover for those who haven't yet seen. I love it. And I also, I love this. Anyway, there's lots of book as object things that we could talk about for a long time. As I think Annie can attest, and maybe Zachary as well, I felt so uncertain about like what I wanted this book to look like as a book. It just was like a kind of completely foreign concept to me of these words that has just existed on a page. And I don't know, it was one of the most daunting things possible. And I was like, if I had to describe what I want, I wouldn't even have the vocabulary to do it. So I think it was another instance of the beauty of collaboration in this process, where it really was through lots of different examples that the art department produced, feedback from Annie, feedback from, many people behind the scenes that I'm sure I wasn't aware of, that it came into being. And I think that feels really apt to me. I think I'm sure there are some authors that have a really specific sense of what the book needs to look like, but a little bit like titles, it felt like another moment of really profound uncertainty where I was reliant and relieved by the insights of other people.
Thank God for designers. I think if my memory serves, we came to this idea of like stars and maybe planets or moons because there's this very wonderful imagery at the end of your story, Old Hope, that involves the kind that you stick to your ceilings, the glow in the dark. So I think a prior iteration that hopefully no one saw because it was a bad idea that I had come up with, but it's like to try to do the glow in the dark stars. And lo and behold, we put it in the hands of an actual designer and they were like, gradient, and it worked. So
it worked.
On that note, I will turn it back over, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you once again to Claire and Annie for this fantastic conversation. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Objects of Desire at harvard.com. I've put the link to purchase in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week, keep reading, and stay safe, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Bye, thanks for coming.